The sky was the color of embers dying. That was the first thing she noticed, not the vastness of the land, not the silence that pressed in from every direction like something with weight and intention, but the particular shade of the evening sky, red bleeding into amber, bleeding into the kind of deep violet that comes only in open country, where there is nothing tall enough to interrupt the horizon. In the city where she had grown up, the sky was something glimpsed between rooftops, a narrow strip of evidence that the world extended beyond brick and coal smoke. Out here, the sky was everything. It went on until looking at it made something ache behind her sternum. Nora Vale pressed her fingers against the window glass of the coach and did not blink. On the hill ahead, small against all that burning color, a child stood alone. A girl from the shape of her. Dark hair loose and lifted by the wind, the hem of her dress moving like something alive. She was not running. She was not playing. She was simply standing on the high ground above the ranch with her face turned toward the horizon, as though she were watching for something that had not yet arrived, or waiting for something she already knew would not come back. Below the hill, a man stood in the yard. He was watching the child. His hat was pushed back slightly, and even from this distance, even through smeared coach glass, Nora could read the quality of his stillness. It was not the stillness of peace. It was the stillness of a person who has learned to hold themselves very carefully, the way you hold something fragile that cannot be set down. Then the coach wheels found a rut and lurched, and the man turned toward the sound. His posture changed, not dramatically, no sudden squaring of shoulders, no obvious preparation, just a subtle shift, the way a door closes without slamming. Whatever had been open in his face when he looked at that child on the hill was gone by the time he looked toward the road. Nora pulled her fingers from the glass and sat back. Beside her, her brother Theo was already gathering his things with the particular energy of a 13-year-old who had been sitting still for too long. He knocked his elbow into her arm, said nothing by way of apology, and pressed his own face to the window instead. "Is that it?" he asked. "That's it. It's smaller than I thought. It's a ranch, Theo, not a town. I know what it is." He wiped the glass with his sleeve, which did nothing to improve the view. "The fence looks sturdy, at least." Nora almost smiled. This was her brother's way of being encouraging, finding the structural integrity of things, offering it up like a gift. She had raised him to be practical. She supposed she had succeeded. The coach rolled to a stop in the yard, and the driver called down something that got lost in the wind. Nora took one breath. Just one. Then she gathered her bag, pushed open the door, and stepped down into the last light of the day. The ground was harder than she expected. The air smelled of sage and something drier, older, like earth that had been baked and baked until all the softness cooked away. It was nothing like the damp, close air of the city she had left behind. The city where her father had lived and worked and finally died in a narrow upstairs room while she sat beside him holding his hand and knowing, in the part of her that had absorbed every lesson he had ever taught her, that it was already too late. She did not think about that now. She was very good, by this point, at not thinking about that now. Theo jumped down behind her, landing with a thud that sent up a small cloud of dust, and immediately looked around with the frank curiosity of someone who has not yet learned to disguise his interest. The man from the yard was walking toward them. He was taller than she had gauged from a distance, with the kind of lean, deliberate build that comes from years of physical work rather than any particular intention. His face was weathered in a way that made his age difficult to read. Somewhere in his late 30s, she guessed, though the set of his eyes suggested he had been older than his years for quite some time. Those eyes were a gray that shifted toward blue in the fading light, and they moved over her and Theo with the methodical attention of someone accustomed to assessing what a situation actually is rather than what it appears to be. He stopped a few feet away, looked at Theo, looked back at her. "The advertisement," he said, "did not mention children." His voice was low and even, with the particular flatness of someone who had learned to keep feeling out of his words as a matter of habit. Nora did not apologize. She had decided on the long journey here that she would not begin this with an apology, because an apology would suggest she had done something wrong, and she had not. She had simply done what was necessary. "My letter," she said, "also left out a number of things. It seems we both came to this arrangement with some details unspoken." He looked at her for a moment that lasted slightly longer than was comfortable. She held his gaze, not defiantly. She was not here to establish dominance. She was not a fool. But steadily, with the calm of someone who has faced worse silences than this one. Then he stepped to the side, and the path to the front door was open. He did not say come in. He did not say welcome. He simply moved and left the rest to her. Nora picked up her bag and walked toward the house. The inside was cleaner than she had expected and emptier than she had hoped. Not empty of furniture. There was a table, chairs, shelves, a good stone fireplace with iron tools hung neatly beside it, but empty of the small evidence of living that accumulates in spaces where people allow themselves to be comfortable. No flowers, no fabric beyond what was strictly functional, no smell of anything cooking or anything recently cooked. The curtains were plain and unhemmed. The shelf held tools and a few books, spine out, without any visible system of arrangement. A man had been living here alone for a long time, and the house wore that fact plainly. Nora set her bag down near the door and turned to look at the room more carefully. That was when she saw the child. The girl she had watched from the coach window was sitting at the far end of the table, and she was not on the hill anymore. She was right here, 7 feet away, and she was watching Nora with eyes that were almost unsettlingly attentive for a child her age. Dark eyes, still. A sheet of paper in front of her, and a pencil held loosely in one hand, but nothing drawn on the paper yet. She did not say hello. She did not look away. Nora did not look away either. She had been around enough sick and frightened children in her father's work to know that looking away first was a kind of abandonment. You stayed. You held the eye contact gently, the way you hold something wounded, firmly enough that it knows it's held, loosely enough that it doesn't feel trapped. "Hello," Nora said quietly. The girl did not respond, but something shifted in her expression. Not toward warmth, not yet, but away from the particular wariness of a creature that has decided the only safe position is readiness to flee. Behind Nora, Theo had come inside, and in the way of 13-year-olds everywhere, he assessed the situation in approximately 1 second and decided the most useful thing he could do was behave as though nothing were unusual. He pulled out the chair across from the girl, sat down uninvited, and reached for a blank corner of paper from the stack on the table's edge. He produced a stub of pencil from his pocket. He always had one. Nora had no idea where they came from. And began to draw. It was a horse. It was a very bad horse. The legs were the wrong length, and the head was too large, and it appeared to be smiling, which horses did not generally do. The girl looked at it. A long moment passed. Then, without a word, without any change in her expression, she picked up her own pencil and leaned slightly across the table and corrected the angle of the horse's back leg with a single precise line. Theo looked at the correction, looked at the girl, nodded once with the gravity of a craftsman acknowledging a valid critique. Nora felt something loosen very slightly in her chest. The man, Colt Rains, his name was Colt Rains, she had his letters in her bag, had come inside and was standing near the fireplace, watching none of this and all of it simultaneously. He had a particular quality of attention that she would come to recognize over the following days. The ability to appear to be looking at something else while actually tracking the thing that mattered. "Sit down," he said. "I'll make coffee." It was not warm. It was not unfriendly. It was simply the most efficient path through a situation that neither of them had a script for. Nora sat down. The coffee he made was strong and slightly bitter, and exactly what she needed. They sat across the table from each other while Theo and the girl, Wren, her name was Wren, it was in the letters too, continued their silent exchange of paper and pencil at the far end, and Colt Rains explained the arrangement in the same flat, careful voice he seemed to use for everything. He needed a legal marriage before the hearing. The hearing would determine whether his niece remained in his care or was placed with her father, a man named Edmund Lark, who had not been present in the child's life for 4 years, but who had recently developed a renewed interest in his daughter. That coincided, Colt said, with a look that was not quite anger and not quite contempt, with certain financial developments in his family. In exchange for her cooperation, Nora would have a home, stability, enough income to place Theo in a decent school, and, when the hearing concluded, the freedom to determine her own next steps. He said all of this looking at the table between them rather than at her, with the manner of someone reciting terms they have reviewed privately many times and are now making themselves speak aloud. When he finished, Nora was quiet for a moment. "Does Wren know what this arrangement is?" she asked. He looked up then. The gray eyes settled on her face. "No," he said. She nodded slowly. "Then, as far as she's concerned, I have to be real." It wasn't a question, and he seemed to understand that. He held her gaze for a beat, something shifting in the composed distance he wore through most hours of the day. Not warmth, not yet, but recognition. The acknowledgement that she had understood something he had not had to explain. "That," he said, "is why I needed someone from elsewhere. Someone local would not be able to hold it." Nora looked down at her coffee. She thought about what it would mean to be real to a child who had decided silence was safer than speech. She thought about her father, who had taught her that the hardest kind of medicine was not the kind administered with instruments, but the kind that required you simply to show up fully and stay. She thought about how she had not managed to do that when it counted most. "I understand," she said. She did not say she could do it. She was not in the habit of making promises she wasn't certain she could keep. But she understood. The evening moved on in the way of evenings in unfamiliar places, slowly, with too much awareness of small sounds. Colt showed her the room she would have, which was spare but clean, with a window that looked toward the hills. He brought her trunk in without asking whether she wanted help, set it at the foot of the bed, and left her to settle. Theo had been given the small room off the kitchen, which he declared adequate with the tone of someone who would have declared a hayloft adequate if it meant he got to stay somewhere new. Dinner was simple and quiet. 4 people at a table, 2 of whom had known each other for years and communicated mostly through glances, and 2 who were strangers to everyone in the room, including, in some ways, each other. Wren ate without looking up from her plate. She had brought a piece of paper to the table, and it lay beside her bowl like a place setting, though she did not draw on it during the meal. She seemed to be saving it or guarding it. Nora noticed that she positioned herself so that her back was not entirely to any door. After dinner, Nora washed the dishes at the basin while Colt went out to check the animals. Through the window above the sink, she could see the last gray light dissolving above the tree line. The hills beyond had gone dark and soft, like the edges of something remembered rather than something real. She heard Theo's voice from the other room, low and easy, offering some kind of running commentary that did not require a response. She heard nothing from Wren, but she did not hear Theo's voice change in the way it changed when he was speaking to himself, which meant the girl was still there, still listening. Nora dried her hands on the cloth by the sink and stood for a moment in the quiet kitchen. She had come here as a practical matter. That was the truth of it. Her father's debts were real. The winter had been coming, and with it, the reality that she could not keep Theo and herself fed on what remained after those debts took their portion. She had answered the advertisement without particular feeling, the way you make a business decision, weighing what was needed against what was being offered, finding the balance point, committing. She had not expected to feel anything about this place before she had even slept a night in it. But standing in that plain kitchen, listening to her brother's voice in the other room and the distant sound of the man outside moving through the dark with the confidence of someone who had learned this land by living it, she felt something she had not felt in a very long time. She felt like she had arrived somewhere. She put the feeling away carefully. It was too early for feelings like that. She went to bed. She told herself she would sleep. She did not sleep. It was late, past midnight, the kind of deep quiet that settles over open land when even the wind decides to rest. When she heard the sound, not loud, not alarming, just the soft, deliberate sound of someone moving in the hallway. She rose and opened her door without thinking about it. The instinct of someone who has spent years sleeping lightly against the possibility that someone might need her. Colt was sitting on the floor of the hallway. He was outside Wren's door, his back against the wall, his long legs stretched in front of him. His eyes were closed, but she could tell immediately that he was not asleep. His breathing was too careful for sleep, too controlled, the breathing of someone keeping watch with their eyes shut. He heard her door open. His eyes didn't open, but he tilted his head slightly in her direction, the small acknowledgement of someone who is aware without being startled. Nora stood in her doorway and looked at him. She looked at the closed door he was sitting beside, the door behind which a small girl slept, or lay awake, or did whatever it was she did in the dark hours when no one was watching. She looked at the man on the floor, at the way he was sitting, not for comfort, but for vigilance, at the fact that he had not put a chair here. He was on the floor because a chair would have implied intention, and intention would have meant admitting to himself that this was something he did, that he sat outside his niece's door in the night because the alternative was not knowing whether she was frightened, and not knowing was worse than the hard floor. He did this every night. She understood that without being told. Nora went back into her room. She lay down and pulled the blanket up, and looked at the ceiling in the dark. The next morning came gray and cool. Nora was in the kitchen before anyone else, working out the particular logic of the stove. Every stove had its own logic, her father used to say. You just had to listen to it. When she heard footsteps on the porch, and then the particular quiet that meant someone was standing at the door deciding whether to knock, she opened it before they could. The man outside was not Colt. He was well dressed in the careful way of someone who understands that appearance is a form of argument. A dark coat, clean, hair combed, a face that was handsome in a studied way, the kind of handsome that requires maintenance and knows it. Beside him stood a younger man with a leather case, the kind lawyers carried, or men who wanted to appear as though they had lawyers. Edmund Lark looked at her with an expression of polished surprise that she did not believe for a single moment. "I don't believe we've met," he said. "No," Nora agreed. She did not open the door wider. His eyes moved over her with an assessment so smooth it could have passed for friendliness to someone not paying attention. "I was hoping to see my daughter. I was told she lives here." "She's sleeping," Nora said. It was past 7 in the morning. They both knew the claim was unlikely. Edmund Lark smiled as though she had said something charming. Of course. He looked past her into the house, just briefly, with the ease of a man accustomed to looking wherever he chose. "I don't believe I caught your name." "I didn't offer it," Nora said. A beat of silence. His smile did not change. It was the smile of a man who had learned that maintaining the smile was itself a kind of power. It made you seem unrattled, while the other person worked out whether they had been rude. Nora had grown up watching her father negotiate with landlords and suppliers and the families of patients who could not pay. She knew every variation of that smile. Behind her, she heard footsteps, Colt's. She recognized them already by their deliberate evenness. And then he was beside her, one hand resting lightly on the doorframe above her head. "Edmund," he said. "Colt." Edmund's gaze moved between them with an expression that was performing pleasant surprise badly. "I didn't realize you had company." "She's not company," Colt said. Edmund looked at Nora again. This time the pleasantness in his face thinned slightly at the edges, like paper held too close to a flame. Then he recovered it. "Well, I'll come back at a better time." He touched the brim of his hat, not to Colt, but to her, which was its own kind of message, and turned back toward the road where a horse waited. Nora and Colt stood in the doorway and watched him go. When he had rounded the bend and disappeared from sight, Colt lowered his arm from the doorframe. They were standing closer than they had been at any point since she arrived, and for a moment neither of them moved. Then Nora said quietly, "He knew I was here." Colt's jaw tightened. Yes, he wasn't surprised. She thought about the way Edmund's eyes had found her immediately, with the practiced aim of someone locating a thing they had been told to locate. "He's been watching the ranch." "Probably," Colt said. For a while, Nora looked toward the road, now empty, and felt something settle in her. Not fear, exactly, but its more useful cousin. The sharp clarity that comes when you understand that the situation is more serious than you had allowed yourself to fully believe. She turned back into the kitchen. The coffee had finished. She poured 2 cups without asking and set one on the table. And then she heard it. From the far end of the house came a sound she had not heard in all the hours since she arrived. Small and deliberate, moving through the house like water finding its level. Wren stood at the edge of the kitchen doorway in her nightgown, feet bare on the wood floor. She was not looking at Nora. She was looking toward the front of the house, toward the door that led to the road where Edmund Lark had just stood. Her face was not frightened. It was something older than frightened, something that made Nora's chest compress in a way that had nothing to do with the cold morning air. The little girl had heard everything. Nora did not move toward her. She did not speak. She simply stayed where she was, steady, present, taking up space in the room in the way her father had taught her a person could take up space, not demanding anything, not retreating, just being available, remaining. After a long moment, Wren turned her eyes to Nora. Dark, still eyes that saw too much and gave back a little. Then she walked to the table and sat down in the chair beside where Theo would sit, and she put her paper in front of her, and she picked up her pencil. She did not draw anything yet. She just held the pencil. But she had come to the table, and Nora understood, in the way she had learned to understand the small communications of people who could not or would not use words, that this was not a small thing. This was, in fact, the beginning of everything. The days that followed had a shape to them that Nora learned the way you learn a new language. Not all at once, not from any book, but through immersion and repetition and the slow accumulation of small understandings. Colt Rains woke before the sun. She knew this because she could hear him. Not loudly. He moved through the house with the particular quiet of someone who had spent years not waking a child. But she slept lightly enough to track the sounds. The soft drag of boots on floorboards. The low complaint of the back door. Then silence for an hour or more, while he was out with the horses. And the strange comfort of knowing that someone else was awake in the dark. She began rising earlier herself. Not to match him. She had no interest in performing industry for its own sake. But because she found she could not sleep past a certain hour in this place, where the silence was so complete that her own thoughts became too loud to ignore. Better to be in the kitchen with something useful to do than lying in the unfamiliar bed cataloging everything she had left behind and everything she had yet to understand about where she had arrived. She reorganized the kitchen on the third morning. She did it without asking, which she recognized as presumptuous and did anyway, because the existing arrangement made no logical sense. The herbs stored too near the heat, the heavier tools on the highest shelf, the basin positioned so that anyone washing dishes stood with their back to the room. She moved things methodically, with the quiet efficiency her father had modeled for her in the small dispensary where she had learned to think. When Colt came in at midday and found everything in different places, he stopped in the doorway. She watched him take in the changes without comment. He opened the cabinet where the cups now lived, closed it again, opened the drawer where she had relocated the smaller tools. He did not say anything. He made his coffee from the resettled shelf and sat at the table and drank it. The next morning, she noticed he had adjusted the angle of the wash basin slightly, turning it so that anyone standing at it had a cleaner sightline to the door. It was a small change, and a careful one, and it told her more about him than any conversation they had managed so far. She was learning him in pieces. That was how it seemed to work with a man like Colt Rains, not in declarations or explanations, but in the accumulation of small evidence. The way he checked the latch on Wren's window every evening before going to bed. The way he always filled Wren's water cup first at meals before anyone else had been served without appearing to think about it. The pair of worn leather gloves hanging inside the barn door with a small pair beside them. Wren's size, oiled and maintained with the same care as his own. The gloves had been there for years. She could tell by the softness of the leather, the way they had conformed exactly to the shape of the hands that wore them. He had been keeping this child warm and fed, and as safe as one person could keep another, doing it without acknowledgement, without anyone standing beside him to say, "Yes, this is enough. What you are doing is enough." Nora thought about that more than was probably useful. She was learning Wren differently, through proximity and patience, which were the only tools that worked. The girl did not respond to direct approach. She did not respond to questions. She did not respond to the kind of bright, encouraging warmth that well-meaning adults sometimes deployed around quiet children, the performative cheerfulness that was really just discomfort in a better costume. Nora had tried none of these things. She had simply continued to exist in the same spaces Wren existed in, doing her own work, available without being demanding. On the fourth day, she brought her bag of dried herbs to the kitchen table and began sorting and labeling them in the late afternoon while the light was still good. She spread them in small piles by type and worked in silence, using a system her father had taught her, the oldest sorting method, by smell and color and the memory of where each plant grew and what it was for. Wren drifted in from wherever she had been and sat at the far end of the table. She did not ask what Nora was doing. She watched. After a while, Nora slid a small bundle of dried leaves toward the center of the table without looking up. Not an offering, exactly. Just a thing placed where it could be reached. Several minutes passed. Then Wren's hand moved. She picked up the bundle and brought it close to her face, breathing it in slowly, with an attention that was nearly reverent. Nora kept her eyes on her own work. The next afternoon, Wren put a piece of paper on the table beside Nora's sorting area. On it was a careful drawing of a plant. The proportions accurate, the root system included, the leaves individually distinct. It was a better botanical sketch than most trained people could produce. She had been paying attention for a long time to the natural world. This child. She had been watching and recording and storing knowledge in the way that people do when they have no other safe outlet for what they are capable of. Nora looked at the drawing for a long moment. "This one is for fever," she said quietly. "Your drawing is more accurate than the one in my father's book." Wren didn't respond, but she pulled the paper back toward herself and looked at it again with an expression that was, perhaps, the very distant cousin of satisfaction. Theo had his own approach, which was to treat Wren with the same casual matter-of-factness he applied to most of life's challenges. He did not try to make her talk. He did not try to include her in a pointed way. He simply continued his own existence in her vicinity with the unself-conscious ease of someone who has not yet learned that silence is supposed to be uncomfortable. He brought a book of illustrated maps to the kitchen one evening and spread it open on the table and spent an hour examining it with the absorbed interest of someone planning expeditions he intended to take when he was older and less supervised. Wren ended up leaning over to look at a page he was studying. Theo shifted the book slightly so she could see better without being asked to. They remained like that for some time, two children bent over maps of places neither of them had been, and if they communicated anything to each other in that time, it happened in a language that did not require words. Nora saw Colt watching this from the doorway of the hall. His expression was unguarded for just a moment, something almost painful in it. The look of a person watching something they had not allowed themselves to hope for. Then he noticed her noticing, and he went back to whatever he had been doing. It was raining on the 9th night when she heard him in the barn. She had woken to the sound of the storm and could not find her way back to sleep. She rose and went to the kitchen for water, and through the window she could see the lamp burning in the barn across the yard, burning steadily, which meant someone was in there working, not simply passing through. She stood at the window for a moment. Then she pulled on her coat. The barn smelled of hay and horse, and the particular sharp, clean smell of rain on wood. Colt was on his knees in the far stall, working by lantern light, and the calf on the ground in front of him was the immediate and obvious emergency. A bad position, a wound on the foreleg that looked like it had caught on something in the dark and wet. The calf was not panicking, which meant either it had run out of fight or it had decided, in the way that animals sometimes did, to trust the person kneeling beside it. Nora did not ask whether he needed help. She picked up the spare lantern from the hook by the door, lit it from the flame of the first, and positioned herself so that the light fell cleanly on his hands. He glanced up once, then he went back to work. They were in there for nearly an hour. She did not try to assist beyond the light. She understood enough to know that his hands knew what they were doing, that adding a second pair would only complicate the particular rhythm he was working in. So she held the lantern and stayed out of his way, and handed things when he needed them, anticipating the needs correctly enough that he stopped having to ask. When he was done, the calf was bandaged and settled, and the crisis had passed into the category of things that would probably be fine. Colt sat back on his heels and let out a slow breath. His hands were resting on his thighs, the damage accumulated over years visible even in the dim light, the nicks and calluses, the particular rough competence of hands that had learned their purpose and stayed with it. He reached out and rested those hands on the calf's side for a moment, not checking, not examining, just resting there, a small gesture in the direction of reassurance. "You could have sold her," Nora said. The words came out before she had considered them. "The calf, earlier in the season, she's had difficulties." "I know," he said. "Why didn't you?" He was quiet for a moment. He did not look at her. "She was here," he said, "and she needed something." Nora was quiet too, for a moment that went on slightly past the point where a response would have been merely polite. The rain was loud on the roof, and the lantern made the shadows move, and the calf breathed steadily under Colt's hands. "I understand that," she said at last. He looked at her then. The lantern light was not generous. It made everything look older, more worn, and in it, his face was tired and open in a way it was not during the hours of the day when he was moving through the world and holding himself correctly. She saw for just a moment what he looked like when he was not performing competence. He looked like someone who was very tired and had been for a long time and would probably continue to be for the foreseeable future, and had made a kind of peace with that, the way you make peace with a landscape that is beautiful and harsh in equal measure. She put down her lantern and turned toward the barn door before she could examine the way that realization was settling in her chest. Sybil came on a morning around the second week when the light had changed, the hills pulling in a different quality of gold that Nora was beginning to recognize as particular to this place and this season. Nora had heard the name once from Colt, delivered briefly and without embellishment. A woman in town had known the Rains family long enough that her opinion carried weight. This was consistent with what walked through the door when Sybil arrived unannounced at 10 in the morning and sat herself down at the kitchen table with the ease of someone who had done it many times before. She was somewhere past 60, with the upright bearing of a woman who had never seen the use of apologizing for the space she occupied. Her eyes were sharp and dark and moved over Nora with an appraisal that made no attempt to disguise itself. "So," she said, folding her hands on the table, "you're the one he sent for." "I'm Nora Vale," Nora said, and put coffee in front of her. "I know who you are." Sybil picked up the cup and examined it, not the coffee, just the cup, as though testing the standard of things. "What I'm interested in is whether you know what you've stepped into." "I have some idea." Sybil set the cup down. "Edmund Lark has been building his case for 2 years. He has a lawyer who's very good and very patient, and he has money enough to wait out most opponents. The last time he took Colt to a hearing, Colt lost. He kept the girl only because Edmund had other problems that year that required his attention. Those problems are resolved now." She paused, and the weight of what she was leaving unsaid pressed into the space between them. "Edmund isn't coming back for a daughter he loves. He's coming back for a daughter who is, by now, the surviving heir to a considerable property trust from her mother's family. The trust releases when she turns 18, and the administrator of that trust is whoever holds legal guardianship." Nora was quiet. She had understood some of this from Colt's explanation and suspected more. Hearing it laid out in Sybil's direct, unhurried way was different from suspecting. It made the shape of the danger fully visible. "Does Colt know all of this?" she asked. "He knows what he knows," Sybil said. "He's a man who is very good at the concrete, and less good at the parts that require him to think like someone who would do a thing like this." She looked at Nora steadily. "You, on the other hand, seem like you might be able to think in that particular direction." Nora looked at the table between them. She thought about Edmund's smile at the door, the way his eyes had found her immediately, with too much precision. "He already knows about me," she said. "He was watching the ranch. When he came to the door, he wasn't surprised. He'd been informed." Sybil's expression did not change, but something in her eyes shifted. "Yes," she said simply. "So he knows the marriage is new. He's going to try to use that. He's going to try to establish that it isn't a real marriage," Sybil said. "That it was arranged for the purposes of the hearing." She paused in a way that was not quite delicate. "Which is something you are perhaps better positioned than I am to speak to." The word perhaps was doing considerable work in that sentence. Nora recognized it, and recognized that Sybil had chosen it deliberately, offering a kind of door that Nora could walk through or not. "I would think," Nora said carefully, "that what Edmund is going to have difficulty establishing is not the recency of the arrangement, but the absence of the thing that makes a home." She kept her eyes on the table. "Paperwork can be questioned. What Wren draws on her paper is harder to argue with." A silence. Then Sybil said, "You noticed what she draws." "She's been drawing the same house for years," Nora said, "with 2 figures. She's added figures recently." Sybil looked at her for a long moment. Then, very slowly, the sharp face softened at the edges. Not into warmth exactly, but into something that might, given time and sufficient evidence, become it. "He has a long reach," Sybil said finally, "and he is not above using information he shouldn't have. I would be careful about what you keep where." She finished her coffee and stood with the efficiency of someone who has delivered what they came to deliver and sees no reason to linger. At the door, she turned back. He came to me, she said. Edmund, a few weeks ago, tried to establish me as a sympathetic ear. She paused. I am not a sympathetic ear. I gathered, Nora said. The corner of Sybil's mouth moved. It might have been the beginning of a smile. Good, she said, and then she was gone. That evening, Nora sat across from Colt at the table after dinner and said in the same direct tone she had been practicing since she arrived, He took you to a hearing before. 2 years ago. You didn't tell me that. The stillness that moved over Colt's face was different from his usual kind. This one had a quality of bracing in it, the slight tightening of someone who has been expecting a particular blow and is now receiving it. No, he said. I didn't. Why not? He looked at the table. The lamp between them made the shadows fall across the planes of his face in ways that aged him, revealed him. He was quiet long enough that she began to understand the silence itself was the beginning of the answer. Because if you'd known, he said at last, you wouldn't have come. She let the words sit there between them for a moment. The honesty of them was difficult to dispute. She probably would not have come, or not without more information, which amounted to the same thing. You're right, she said. I likely would not have. She watched his face. But I came. So now we continue forward with all of the information. She paused. All of it, Colt. Going forward. He looked at her then. The directness of it seemed to cost him something. Holding her gaze required the same kind of deliberate effort that speaking plainly required him. These were not things that came easily to a man who had spent years communicating primarily with a child who did not use words and horses who did not need them. Yes, he said. It was not an apology. She had not asked for one. It was simply an agreement, and she found it more useful than any apology would have been. She was about to say something else when Theo appeared in the doorway in a state that she recognized immediately. A particular combination of trying to appear casual while being in possession of something he was uncertain how to handle. He came to the table and stood for a moment. Then he reached into the pocket of his jacket and produced a folded piece of paper and an envelope. He set them on the table in front of Nora. A man gave me this in town, he said, when I was at the feed store with the list you gave me. He looked at the envelope, not at her. He was dressed nicely. He said someone wanted to talk to you, and that you'd understand. Nora did not touch the envelope immediately. She looked at Theo. Did you open it? No, Theo said. Then, it was already in my pocket for a while before I decided to give it to you. I thought about it. He looked up at her then, with the expression he wore when he was being more adult than his years had technically qualified him for. I thought you should see it, but it didn't feel right. The man. He was friendly in the way that people are friendly when they want something. Nora reached out and put her hand on his arm briefly. You did the right thing, she said. After Theo went to bed, she opened the envelope. The paper inside was brief, the handwriting careful and deliberate, the handwriting of someone who understood that written words were also a form of evidence. It said that the writer was aware of the circumstances of her arrival and the nature of her arrangement with Colt Rains. It said that this awareness was not intended as a threat. It said that should she be willing to provide certain confirmations of a straightforward nature, she would find herself considerably relieved of certain practical pressures. Specifically, the concerns that had led her to answer an advertisement in the first place. There was money folded inside the letter, a significant amount. Nora set the money on the table without unfolding it further and looked at the letter for a long time. Then she looked up at Colt, who had read it over her shoulder by this point and was standing very still. Edmund Lark had expected her to open this letter alone, had expected the money to be an argument she would make to herself in private, in the dark, in the small hours when the practical considerations of her situation would press hardest. He had calculated her as a woman with no options. She picked up the letter and held it out to Colt. "We should keep this," she said. "It's going to matter later." He took it. He was looking at her with something she did not have a precise name for. Not quite surprised, because she thought he had perhaps hoped she would do exactly this, but the particular expression of a person who has hoped for something and then actually received it and is not quite sure what to do with the sensation of that. "Nora," he said. It was the first time he had used her name without it being the opening of a sentence about something practical. Just her name, said, with a weight she felt in the middle of her chest. "We continue forward," she said, "with all of it." She went to bed. She lay in the dark and listened to the night sounds of the ranch, which she was learning the way she was learning everything here, slowly, carefully, with attention to what each sound meant and where it came from. The horses settling, the wind through the grass, the particular silence that meant everyone in the house was still and safe. She was beginning to know the difference between those silences. From down the hall, she heard the soft drag of Colt's boots on the floorboards, the quiet of him settling into his vigil outside a small girl's door. She closed her eyes. She was still awake when the letter came under her door. She knew it was not from Edmund. The paper was the wrong size. Small, torn carefully from a larger sheet. The kind of improvised correspondence that belonged to someone who did not often write letters and was making do with what was at hand. She picked it up and unfolded it by the gray light coming through her window. It was a drawing. A house, rendered in pencil with careful lines and accurate proportions. And in front of the house, 4 figures. 1 tall, 1 medium height, 1 boy, 1 small girl. Above the house, in letters that were still learning their shape, home. Nora held the drawing for a long time in the dark. Then she folded it, very carefully, and placed it in the inside pocket of her coat, close to where she kept the dried herbs and the small worn notebook her father had given her, and the other things she carried that she could not afford to lose. The drawing stayed folded against her heart as she finally closed her eyes, and the dark outside was full of the sounds she was learning to name, and the house breathed around her with the quiet of something that had decided, without consulting her, that she belonged in it. The letters were still in the barn. Nora had not gone looking for them. She had simply been searching for a length of twine in the small office alcove off the main barn. A narrow space with a shelf and a hook and a wooden box that served as a catch-all for the miscellaneous requirements of ranch life, when she saw the bundle wedged behind the box. A stack of envelopes tied with a strip of leather cord. The kind of cord that gets used for everything out here until it's too worn for anything, and then gets used a little longer still. The envelopes were weathered at the edges, the paper gone soft with age and handling. The addresses were written in a hand she did not recognize. The name on each one was the same. She put the twine in her pocket and left the letters where they were. That evening, after Wren and Theo had gone to bed, she was at the kitchen table with her notebook when Colt came in from his final round of the property. He washed his hands at the basin, poured himself coffee from what remained in the pot, stood for a moment looking at his cup in the way he sometimes stood looking at things. Not lost in thought, she had come to understand, but giving himself a moment to settle from the work of the day into the different work of being inside, among people, in the quieter and in some ways more demanding hours. She said, without looking up from her notebook, "There are letters in the barn, behind the box, in the alcove." He went very still. She kept her eyes on the page. "I wasn't looking for them. I found them when I was getting twine." A long silence. The lamp on the table made a small sound, the wick needing attention. "I know they're there," he said. "I know you know," she said. She looked up then, because the quality of the silence had changed in a way that required witnessing. He was still standing at the basin with his coffee, not looking at her, his profile to the lamp. The careful composure he maintained during the day had dropped away in the way it sometimes did in these late hours, leaving something more unguarded in its place. "I haven't opened them," he said. It came out low, not quite even. "I know," she said. "You asked me once why I didn't." He set the coffee cup down on the counter, carefully, as though it required attention. "I told you it was because I didn't want to understand, that I wanted to stay angry." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "That was part of it. The other part was, if I read them, they're finished. Whatever he was trying to say, whatever he wanted me to know, it's over. I can't ask him anything else." He stopped again. The sentence seemed to have run into something it couldn't get past. "He's been gone a long time, but those letters are still here." Nora looked at him. She thought about the particular mathematics of grief, how it did not follow the logic of time, how a person could hold loss in stasis for years by keeping some element of it unresolved. A letter unopened, a question unasked, a door not quite closed, so the possibility of an answer could not be extinguished. She thought about the notebook her father had kept that she had not opened for months after he died, because opening it would mean reading what he had written without being able to respond. She had eventually opened it. The grief on the other side had been enormous, and it had also, after a time, been a different shape than the grief before it. More specific, more real, easier, in the end, to carry. She did not say any of this. It was not what the moment required. "There's no rule about when," she said. "They'll be there whenever you're ready." He looked at her then. The directness of it, the quality of effort it required him, was becoming one of the things she recognized about him most immediately. "What did you do," he said, "with the things your father left?" She had not told him much. She had mentioned her father in passing, in the practical context of her skills and their origin. She had not explained the shape of what losing him had made of her. "It took me a long time," she said honestly, "to go through them, to open things." She paused. He left a notebook, recipes, formulas, the way he organized what he knew. "I couldn't open it for a long time because as long as I hadn't read all of it, there was still something of him I hadn't received yet. It felt like losing him again to finish it." The kitchen was very quiet. The lamp had found its level. From somewhere outside, the sound of wind through dry grass, the patient voice of the land. "And when you did?" Colt asked. "It was worse," she said. "And then it was better." She looked at the table. It took a while for the second part. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he came away from the counter and sat down at the table across from her, not with anything to do, just sitting, which was unusual enough that she noticed it. "My brother," he said slowly, as though choosing each word with the care of someone handling something fragile, "was not a simple man to love. He needed things that were hard to give: room, patience, The ability to watch someone make choices you would not make and not say so. He looked at his hands on the table. I was not always good at that. The patience. You're patient with Wren, Nora said. That's different. How? He considered. Wren never chose silence to punish anyone. She chose it because it was the only safe place she could find. He paused. My brother chose things. Actively. He chose to go. He left. And I was angry. I was angry and I held on to it because it was easier than the other things underneath it. What was underneath it? She asked quietly. The question sat in the air between them. She had not planned to ask it. It had come from the same instinct that sometimes moved her hands before she had consciously decided what they were doing, the trained habit of going toward the thing that needed attending. He did not answer immediately. The silence went on long enough that she thought he would not answer at all. Then he said, Worry. The whole time he was gone, I didn't know if he was alive. He looked at the lamp. I didn't know if Wren's father was alive or dead. I was raising his daughter, and I didn't know. A pause. It's a strange thing to grieve someone who might not be dead. Nora thought about the particular cruelty of that kind of uncertainty, how it kept a wound perpetually open, how the ordinary work of grief became impossible when loss itself was not confirmed. When did you find out he was alive? She asked. About a year ago. Secondhand. Someone who'd passed through where he was staying mentioned it. His jaw moved. He's alive. He just chose not to come back. Another silence, the kind that comes after something essential has been said, something held in so long that the act of saying it aloud is itself a kind of wound. Nora did not fill it. She had learned in her father's work and in the years since that some silences needed to stay silent for a while before anything useful could grow in them. After a time, Colt said, The letters have been there since before he left. He wrote them and left them. He knew I would find them. He didn't trust himself to say things to my face. That was one of the ways he was. When you're ready, Nora said again, quietly. He looked at her. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite relief, not quite gratitude, but living in the neighborhood of both. The specific look of a person who has said a hard thing out loud and found, against reasonable expectation, that the air on the other side of saying it was breathable. Thank you, he said. Just that, without elaboration. It was the first time he had said those words to her about anything personal. She felt their weight precisely. She picked up her pen and went back to her notebook. He sat at the table for a while longer, not reading, not doing anything in particular, just sitting in the presence of another person in the way of someone who had forgotten. That was something available to him. She did not comment on it. She simply continued working and let him stay. The afternoon, 3 days later, was the one that would come back to her later, repeatedly, with the particular vividness of moments that only reveal their significance in retrospect. She was on the back porch with her sorting and labeling, working in the good light of late afternoon. The season was deepening, and the light had taken on the amber quality that comes when summer concedes, pressing closer to the horizon, warming everything it touched to gold before letting go for the day. She heard the soft sound of bare feet on the porch boards. Wren came and sat beside her, not across from her, not at a careful distance. Beside her, close enough that their shoulders were nearly touching, with the unself-conscious proximity of a child who has decided, in whatever internal calculation she runs, that a person has been sufficiently observed, and may now be trusted with nearness. Nora did not move. She continued her work, breathing normally, giving the moment room to exist without the pressure of her attention. They sat together for a while in the amber light. The wind moved across the grass below the porch, and the horses in the corral moved, and the ordinary sounds of the ranch went on around them. Then, in a voice so small and disused it barely occupied the air, "Do you know which plant smells like her?" Nora did not ask who. She knew. She set down what she was holding and looked at the bundles arranged on the boards beside her. She moved through them slowly, without hurry, the way you search for something you know is there and want to find correctly rather than quickly. She picked up a small bundle and held it out toward Wren, not pressing it into her hands, just offering, in the space between them. "This one," she said quietly. "It grows in open fields. Better in late summer. Some people call it lavender. It has a lot of names, depending on where you're from." Wren looked at the bundle for a moment. Then she reached out and took it, and brought it to her face with both hands, and breathed. She closed her eyes. Nora looked away, toward the hills, because some moments are not meant to be watched directly. When she looked back, Wren's eyes were still closed. The bundle of lavender was still held against her face, and there was, moving across the child's features with the hesitant progress of something that has not happened in a very long time and is not certain of its welcome, the shape of a smile, not large, not dramatic, just a small curve at the corner of a mouth that had forgotten the motion, finding it again. Nora felt it move through her chest like something loosening, like a door that has been jammed opening slowly, without force, because the conditions are finally right. She did not speak. She picked up her pen and went back to her notebook. Beside her, Wren sat holding the lavender and did not move for a long time, and the afternoon light held them both in its amber, and the wind was gentle, and it was enough. She told Colt that evening, briefly, while Wren and Theo were occupied at the far end of the house. She said only that Wren had spoken to her, and what she had asked and what Nora had given her. She kept it brief because she understood that the size of it could only properly be held by the two of them together, that to elaborate would somehow reduce it. She watched him receive the information. She watched something come over his face that was not the composed distance of his default hours, but something deeper and less managed. The stillness of a person absorbing something that matters more than they can immediately process. He looked away from her, toward the window. His hand on the table opened, then closed. 4 years, he said. It was barely a sentence. It was just the number, laid down. "I know," she said. They did not say anything else about it that night. But later, when she was in her room with the lamp low and the notebook in her lap, she heard him in the hall, and the soft sound of him settling outside Wren's door. And something in the quality of that familiar sound was different tonight. Less like vigilance, more like gratitude. Edmund changed his approach on a morning when the light was wrong. Flatter than usual, overcast in the particular way that made everything look slightly more stark than it was. He came around the long way, from the direction of the fields, and she understood immediately that this meant he had been on or near the property in a way that was not ordinary. He came alone this time, without the lawyer, and something in his bearing had the quality of a man who has made a decision and is now implementing it. He stopped at a distance that was just slightly too close for comfort and just far enough to be technically unremarkable. "I wonder if I might speak with you," he said to her, not to Colt, who was visible near the barn, to her specifically, which was itself a statement. "You're speaking to me now," Nora said. His eyes moved over her with the careful inventory she had learned to expect. "A woman in your position," he said slowly, "must think about security. Practically speaking, I respect what you're doing here. I imagine it seemed like a good solution to a difficult problem. These things often do, initially." She looked at him steadily and said nothing. "Children form attachments," he said. "It's a natural process. It can make certain situations feel more significant than they are, from the outside. My daughter has had a difficult time. I understand that. I would like the opportunity to provide her with something more stable, more certain." Nora thought about the lavender, about the small bundle held in two small hands, and the smile that had not happened in years happening, about the drawing folded in the pocket of her coat, about the letters sitting unopened in the barn because a man who was not certain the world was safe had chosen to hold something in reserve rather than risk finishing it. She thought about all of this for exactly as long as it took Edmund's expression to shift almost imperceptibly toward the satisfaction of someone who mistakes silence for concession. Then she said, "Your daughter hasn't been attached to you in 4 years. That's not the child's failing." The shift in his expression was small but complete. The polished composure did not disappear. He was too skilled for that. But something behind it went rigid and cold, in a way that told her considerably more about the actual man than anything he had presented so far. "I would be careful," he said quietly, "about the things you stake your situation on. Your position here is provisional." "So is yours," Nora said. She turned and walked back toward the house. Her hands were entirely steady. She was very aware of this, the steadiness of them, because they had not always been steady when she needed them to be, and the knowledge that they were now felt like something she had earned rather than been given. Colt was at the barn door. He had heard enough. When she reached him, she said simply, "He's worried," and she saw in Colt's face the complicated recognition of someone who understands that an enemy's worry is not the same as safety, that worried people often become more dangerous in direct proportion to the clarity with which they see themselves losing. "I know," he said. That night, sitting with her papers after everyone else was asleep, Nora went back through everything she had gathered: Sybil's words, Edmund's letter, the transcript of the previous hearing that Colt had produced from a locked drawer at her request, every document with every word that bore on the situation. She read with the systematic attention her father had applied to a difficult case, looking for the thing that was not immediately visible, the structural fault in the foundation of Edmund's position. She found it in the transcript. She almost missed it. It was a small thing, the kind of thing that seems like procedural noise the first time through. Edmund had stated, under the formal questioning that preceded testimony, that he had not known his daughter's location for a period of over 2 years prior to filing. It was a statement about his knowledge, not about his actions, and it appeared to be the kind of establishing detail that went unquestioned because questioning it would have seemed, at the time, beside the point. But Nora understood how statements in legal documents functioned, how they created the architecture on which subsequent arguments were built, and how a flaw in that architecture, even a small one, had consequences for everything constructed on top of it. If Edmund had known where Wren was, during those 2 years he had claimed not to know, then the foundation of his previous filing was false testimony. She wrote it down in the notebook carefully, without excitement, in the deliberate hand she used for things that needed to be precise. Then she sat back and thought about Sybil, about what Sybil had said regarding letters and information and things she had kept, waiting for the right person to ask the right question. She kept the notebook open on the table and continued reading, and the lamp burned lower, and outside the wind moved through the grass in its patient, continuous way. And somewhere in the house, Colt Raines kept his steady watch, and Nora worked through the dark hours with the focused quiet of someone who has finally understood exactly what she is looking for. The hearing notice arrived on a morning when the first frost had come in overnight. Nora found it on the porch, delivered while the house was still asleep, slipped under the door with the deliberate precision of someone who understood that the hours before dawn were the hours when defenses were lowest, when a piece of paper could do the most damage simply by being the first thing encountered upon waking. She picked it up in her bare feet on the cold boards and read it in the gray light coming through the window glass before she had done anything else, before coffee, before she had fully assembled herself against the day. The date was earlier than anything they had discussed. Not the distant reckoning they had planned for, but something immediate, pressing, a deadline that compressed all their remaining preparation into a window that felt, in the cold, early light, both specific and impossible. She stood with the notice in her hand for a long time. Outside, the frost had turned the grass silver, and the hills beyond it were pale and still under a sky that could not decide yet whether it meant to be clear or gray. A bird moved through the far field, small and purposeful, going somewhere with the certainty of a creature that does not require the landscape to cooperate. She made the coffee. She needed to be entirely present for what came next, and she could not do that until she had done the small, ordinary things that assembled her. Colt came in when the coffee was ready, the way he always came in at this hour, smelling of cold air and horses and the work of early morning. He looked at her face before he looked at anything else. She had noticed he did this. That his first attention when entering a room she occupied went to her expression, reading it for information the way he read the sky for weather. She set the notice on the table between them. He read it standing up. She watched him finish reading, watched him read it a second time, watched the set of his jaw change in the small, controlled way that was his version of what other men expressed more dramatically. 6 weeks, he said. Less, she said. By the time the notice was prepared and delivered, it's closer to 5. He set the paper down. He picked up his coffee. He stood at the table and did not sit, which told her he needed to be upright for this, needed the option of movement. Edmund pushed it forward, she said. Yes. He's doing it because of the letter, because I didn't take the offer. He knows I'm looking for something. He wants less time for me to find it. Colt looked at her. Are you looking for something? Yes, she said. He waited. I need to go to Sybil, she said. Today. There's something she has that we need, and I think she's been holding it until someone asked the right question. She paused. I believe I know what the question is. He did not ask her to explain further. He simply looked at her with the steady attention that was his way of saying he heard her, that he trusted the direction she was moving even when he could not see the full terrain ahead. Go, he said. She went. Sybil answered the door before Nora had finished knocking, which suggested she had been expecting this visit for some time and had perhaps been waiting to see how long it would take. She stood aside to let Nora in and put the kettle on without asking, and sat down at her kitchen table with the composed unhurriedness of someone who knows that the conversation arriving at her door has been traveling a long way to get there and can afford to begin properly. Nora sat across from her and said, without preliminary, "The previous hearing, Edmund stated under questioning that he did not know Wren's location for more than 2 years prior to filing. That statement is the foundation of his argument that he was effectively excluded from his daughter's life." She placed her hands flat on the table. "I don't believe that statement was true. I believe he knew. I believe there is something that demonstrates he knew. And I believe it's here." Sybil looked at her for a long moment with the sharp, dark eyes that missed nothing. Then she said, "What made you certain I had something?" "You told me to be careful about what I kept where," Nora said. "When you first came to the ranch, you said it as a warning, which means you were thinking about documents and the vulnerability of information. You were thinking about it because you had something of your own to protect." She paused. "And when I described what I found in the transcripts, you didn't look surprised. You looked like someone who had been waiting for that particular piece to be named." Sybil was quiet for a moment. The kettle began to make its preliminary sounds on the stove. "Edmund came to me," Sybil said finally, 2 years ago, just before the first filing. "He wanted me to speak at the hearing, a character witness of sorts, someone who could attest to the instability of the situation at the Rains Ranch. I refused. He was not pleased." She paused. "When he left, he made certain statements about what he knew and did not know regarding his daughter's whereabouts. He was expansive. He believed I was on his side, or close enough to it that he could afford to be candid." Her eyes came up to Nora's. "He was wrong about that." "You wrote down what he said," Nora said. "I wrote down what he said," Sybil confirmed. "That evening, in full. And I had it witnessed the following morning by 2 people whose word is not questionable." She stood and went to the far end of the room, to a cabinet that held ordinary things, folded linens, stacked correspondence, the accumulated documentary evidence of a long and attentive life. She opened a specific drawer and removed a sealed envelope and came back to the table and set it between them. "He told me," she said, sitting back down, "that he had been receiving reports on the child's situation for the better part of a year before he filed. Regular reports from someone in town he was paying for the purpose. He knew exactly where she was. He knew who was caring for her. He chose to file when he did not because he had only recently discovered her location, but because the legal timing of certain financial instruments was most advantageous at that point." She looked at the envelope on the table. "He said these things to me as facts, as the kind of facts you share with an ally, because an ally's understanding of the true situation can be useful." Nora looked at the envelope. She thought about Edmund at the ranch door with his practiced smile and his careful words, and about the money folded in the letter he had sent through Theo, and about the way he had looked at Wren through the window on the very first day. Not with the expression of a father who has missed his child, but with the expression of a man calculating the precise value of a thing he intends to acquire. She thought about Wren on the porch with the lavender, about the drawing folded in her coat, about a small girl who had chosen silence as the only safe place available, and was only now, cautiously and impermanently, beginning to test the possibility that safety might exist in other forms. "This is enough," Nora said quietly, not a question. "With the right presentation," Sybil said, "and the right person doing the presenting, yes, I believe it is." She looked at Nora directly. That person is not a lawyer. The lawyers in this territory have complicated relationships with Edmund Lark and his resources. The person who presents this needs to be someone who is not inside that web. Someone who is good with documents and words and the structure of arguments. Someone who understands what they're holding and why it matters. Nora picked up the envelope and held it with both hands and felt the specific weight of it. Not the physical weight, which was negligible, but the other kind. The weight of something that had been kept and preserved and carried through time because someone with enough foresight and enough care had understood that the moment for it would eventually arrive. "Thank you," she said. Sybil made a small dismissive sound that was not quite disagreement. "Don't thank me yet," she said. "Thank me when it's done." She brought the envelope back to the ranch and sat with it at the table for an hour before she opened it, not out of hesitation, but out of the same careful deliberateness her father had applied to everything consequential. She read it twice. She made notes in her own hand of the specific elements and how they connected to the transcript language she had already identified. She built the argument in the notebook, line by line, the way you build something structural. Foundation first, then the weight-bearing elements, then the parts that would be visible to the people in the room. When Colt came in at midday, she laid it out for him. Not everything, not all the technical architecture, but the essential shape of it. Edmund had known. He had paid for information. He had filed not when he found his daughter, but when the financial timing suited him. She had a witnessed written account of him saying so. Colt listened with the focused attention he brought to things that required it. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Can you present it?" he asked. "At the hearing, without a lawyer." "Yes," she said. It was not bravado. It was the same clear-eyed assessment she brought to any problem. He looked at her for a long time. "Nora," he said, and stopped. She waited. "If this doesn't work," he said. His voice was level, but she could hear, under the levelness, the thing that the levelness was managing. "If Edmund takes her, it's going to work," she said. "I need to say this anyway." He put his hands on the table. "If it doesn't work, I need you to know that none of what happens after is something you are responsible for. You came here, and you tried. Whatever the outcome, that was real." She looked at his hands on the table. "It's going to work," she said again, quietly, and with the full weight of her conviction behind it. The hearing arrived on a morning that was gray and cold, with low clouds pressing down over the hills, the sky the color of something unresolved. They went in the wagon, all four of them, Colt driving, Nora beside him on the bench, Wren and Theo in the back with a blanket over their legs. Wren had the lavender bundle in her coat pocket. Nora knew because she had seen her put it there. She had not said anything about it. The room where the hearing was held was a plain rectangular space with wooden chairs arranged in rows facing a long table where the presiding official sat with his documents and his considered authority. It was not a formal courtroom, but it had the weight of one, the particular atmosphere of a space where decisions are made that people will have to live inside for a long time afterward. Edmund was already there when they arrived. He stood near the front with his lawyer and two other men whose presence communicated support, corroboration, the assembled resources of a man who expected to win. He looked at Nora when she came in, and she watched his eyes move to her hands, to the notebook she carried, to the envelope she had placed inside it. And she saw the small, cold shift of a man who has calculated a situation and is encountering a variable he did not include in his calculation. The proceeding began. Edmund's lawyer was as competent as Sybil had described, methodical, precise, building the case with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this many times. The argument was clean. The recency of the marriage, the absence of prior documentation connecting Nora to the ranch, the instability implied by a household that had changed its composition so dramatically in such a short time. Nora sat and listened and took notes in her careful hand and let the argument complete itself. There was a particular kind of attention she had learned in her father's work, the attention that did not react to each element as it arrived, but held the whole structure in view, mapping its weight distribution, identifying where it was load-bearing and where it was decorative. She could see exactly where it was load-bearing. When the lawyer finished and the official looked up and invited a response, Nora set her notebook on the table and stood. She did not look at Edmund. She looked at the official, who was a man of perhaps 60, with the manner of someone who had spent a long time listening to arguments and had developed the capacity to distinguish between those that rested on solid ground and those that rested on the appearance of solid ground. She addressed him directly, without performance, in the same level tone she used for everything that mattered. She said that she would not dispute the recency of her arrival, that it was a verifiable fact, and disputing it would be a waste of the room's time. What she would address instead was the foundation of the opposing argument, because an argument built on a false premise could not be permitted to determine the future of a child, regardless of how well constructed its upper floors might be. She opened the notebook. She read the specific language from the transcript of the previous hearing. Edmund's statement about his lack of knowledge of his daughter's location. She read it carefully and completely, without editorializing. Then she opened the envelope. She explained what it contained. A written account, witnessed and dated, of statements made by Edmund Lark in which he described receiving regular reports on his daughter's location and situation for an extended period prior to his initial filing, in which he described choosing the timing of his filing based on financial considerations rather than the urgency of a father newly aware of his child's circumstances. She named Sybil. She noted that Sybil was present and would confirm the account if called upon. She set the documents on the official's table. The room was quiet with a different quality than before. The first quiet had been the quiet of a proceeding moving along expected lines. This quiet was the quiet of a room recalibrating. Edmund spoke then, for the first time in the proceeding, directly, without his lawyer's intermediary. He spoke to the official, but his eyes moved to Nora. And in his voice, she heard the thing that the composure had been suppressing all along. Not quite anger, though it was adjacent to anger. The specific frustration of a man who has organized his understanding of a situation around a particular variable and found that variable has changed its nature without his permission. He said that the account was the product of a personal animosity, that Sybil had reasons for opposing him that had nothing to do with the welfare of his daughter. The official listened. He looked at the documents. He looked at Edmund. He looked at Nora. He made a note. Then he said that he would take a recess and wished to speak privately with Sybil before continuing. In the hall outside, Nora stood against the wall with her notebook pressed against her chest and let herself breathe. The full breath that she had been managing in careful portions through the previous hour expanded in her chest, and she allowed herself one moment of the vertigo that comes after sustained concentration breaks, the kind that feels almost like falling, until you realize that the ground is still there, and you are still upright. Colt was beside her. She was not sure when he had come to stand there. He was simply present, in the way he was often simply present, not announcing himself, not requiring acknowledgement, just being in the same space with the steady reliability of something fixed. She looked at the opposite wall. "He's rattled," she said quietly. "Yes," Colt said. "Rattled men make decisions from a different place than composed men." She paused. "I don't know yet whether that's in our favor." Colt was quiet for a moment. Then, "You were good in there." She looked at him. He was looking at the same wall she had been looking at, not at her, and his voice had the quality of something said because it needed to be said, rather than because a response was anticipated. "My father taught me," she said. "He taught you well." She thought about the notebook on the shelf at home, the one she had eventually opened, the one that had been worse and then better. She thought about whether her father would recognize what she had done in that room today as something that came from him, from the years of watching him build arguments out of careful attention and precise language, and the refusal to be intimidated by the apparent authority of people who were simply wrong. She thought he would. Wren and Theo were at the far end of the hall, sitting together on a bench. Theo was talking in his low, easy way about something that required gestures, and Wren was watching him with the intense focus of a child who has found that watching is a reliable way to understand the world. As Nora watched, Wren reached into her coat pocket and touched the lavender bundle briefly, the way you touch a thing you are carrying for reassurance, and then withdrew her hand and returned her attention to Theo's story. She was frightened. She was 9 years old, and she was frightened, and she was managing it with the tools available to her, and she was doing it with more composure than most adults Nora had encountered in similar circumstances. Nora felt the compression in her chest that she had felt the first time she understood the full dimensions of this child's situation. The recess lasted the better part of an hour. When they were called back in, the official settled himself at the table with the deliberate unhurriedness of someone who has reached a conclusion and is composing himself to deliver it with appropriate weight. He said that the discrepancy identified in the documentary record raised questions that required further examination before any determination of permanent custody could be responsibly made. He said that the account provided was specific and witnessed and could not be dismissed without due process. He said that Edmund's counsel would be given the opportunity to respond formally to the allegation in a reconvened hearing. And then he said that pending that reconvening, the question of where Wren would reside required an immediate answer, and that he was not prepared, given what had been presented today, to place the child in a situation of additional disruption, and that she would remain in the care of Colt Rains until the matter was fully resolved. The breath that left Colt beside her was the kind of breath that represents the release of something held for much longer than the duration of a single room. She heard it and did not look at him because some things were private, and this was one of them. Edmund stood. He spoke briefly to his lawyer. He did not look at Nora again, which told her more than looking would have. He had looked at her as a variable, and she had changed the equation, and he was now running new calculations. He would not stop. She understood this. One hearing was not the end of a man like Edmund Lark, but the ground had shifted and he knew it. And the knowledge that he knew it was its own kind of relief. Outside, the gray sky had lightened. Not sun, not yet, but the particular brightening that comes when clouds begin to remember that they are not the permanent condition. Theo found Wren's hand and held it with the unselfconscious firmness of someone who has decided that this is what is needed and executed the decision without deliberation. Wren let him. She held his hand back with a grip that communicated something he seemed to understand, because he did not let go either. Nora stood in the cold air and let the aftermath of the morning move through her. She had not let herself feel it fully in the room. She had known that feeling it fully would compromise the precision that the moment required. Now, in the cold air outside, with the immediate crisis resolved into something that would require continued work but was no longer an immediate catastrophe, she let herself feel it. It was large. She had not fully understood, until now, how large it had become. She heard Colt behind her. She heard him stop. She kept her eyes on the middle distance, on the hills visible above the roofline of the town buildings, on the shape of the land that she had been learning since she arrived, and was still learning. That would take years to fully know. "Nora," he said. She turned. He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen from him before, though she recognized its components from the smaller versions of it that had appeared in particular moments over the preceding weeks. This was all of those things at once, and it was not managed or contained or presented in the careful flatness that was his habitual mode. It was simply there, in his face, with the uncomplicated directness of something that has stopped needing permission to exist. "I don't know how to say the things I want to say," he said. It came out levelly, without apology, the statement of a man who has assessed his own limitations honestly and is offering that honesty rather than working around it. She looked at him. The cold air moved between them. "You don't have to say them yet," she said. "We have time now." Something in his expression shifted, not released because it was still entirely present, but settled, like a thing that has been held with effort finally finding a surface to rest on. "Time," he said, as though the word itself was unfamiliar in this context, as though time had previously been the thing running out and was only now, in this moment, becoming something else. "Yes," she said. Theo said something from behind her that was addressed to Wren and provoked a sound from Wren that Nora had not heard before. A small, surprised sound, not quite a laugh, but in the same direction. The sound of something beginning to thaw. When Nora looked back at Colt, she found him watching the same thing, and on his face was the expression she had seen once before, briefly, through a window. The one that looked like pain because the joy was too large and too unexpected, and his face did not have adequate practice with it. She did not say anything. She turned back toward the wagon, and he fell into step beside her, and the four of them moved together through the brightening cold of the morning, back toward the horses and the road and the hills beyond, and the ranch waiting at the end of it. Behind her, Wren made the sound again, the small, startled sound in the direction of a laugh. And this time, she let it come. She did not fight it. She simply let it happen, there in the cold air, in the company of the people who had become, without any formal announcement or ceremony, the specific people she was no longer willing to be without. The ride back to the ranch was quiet in the way that only certain kinds of quiet are. Not the quiet of absence, not the quiet of things unsaid, but the quiet of people who have been through something together and are still inside it, still carrying it, letting it settle at its own pace without forcing it toward resolution before it is ready. Colt drove. Nora sat beside him on the bench with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on the road ahead, on the way the land opened up as they left the town behind and became itself again, wide and pale and indifferent to human urgency in the way of all landscapes that have been here longer than the people moving through them. Behind them, Theo had fallen asleep against the side of the wagon with the immediate, total unconsciousness of the young, the particular collapse of a body that has held tension for hours and releases it all at once the moment safety permits. Wren was not asleep. Nora could hear her breathing, slow and even, and the occasional soft sound of paper. Her notebook, the small one she carried now, the one Nora had given her from a spare in her bag, and which had been filled from the first day with the careful, precise drawings that were Wren's language. The hills moved past on either side. The sky had decided on clear, finally, and the low afternoon light came at an angle that turned everything gold and amber, the particular gold of a season moving through its last generous days before winter arrived with its different palette. Nora watched the light on the grass and felt the morning continuing to move through her, settling into its proper dimensions. It had been enough. The documents, the argument, the witnessed account, it had been enough for today. Edmund would regroup. She was not naive about that. A man with his resources and his particular variety of determination did not accept a single setback as a conclusion, but the ground had shifted in a way that could not be unshifted, and the argument he had built was now visibly constructed on a foundation that the official had seen cracked, and that mattered considerably. She would continue working. She had her father's notebook and her father's method, and the particular tenacity of someone who has discovered, relatively late, what it is they are actually for. Colt said nothing for most of the ride. What was notable was the quality of his silence. It had changed from the careful management of the early weeks into something more like the comfortable quiet of a person who is simply present and does not feel the need to fill the air with evidence of that presence. He drove, and she sat beside him, and the miles passed, and it was, in its way, one of the most ordinary things that had happened between them, which made it also one of the most significant. When the ranch came into view, the long, low house with its covered porch, the barn beyond it, the corral where the horses lifted their heads at the familiar sound of the returning wagon, Nora felt something in her chest that she recognized now without having to translate it. She let herself feel it. The sensation of returning to a place that expected her. The specific comfort of a house that knew the sound of her footstep on its porch. The way the hills behind it had become, without any particular moment of decision, the hills she compared other hills to. She was home. The recognition was quiet and complete, not arrived at in a moment of dramatic revelation, but simply there when you turned toward it, having been there for some time already. Colt brought the wagon to a stop in the yard and set the brake and climbed down and reached up to steady Wren as she descended. Theo woke in the abrupt way he woke from everything, already moving before his eyes were fully open, and swung himself over the side of the wagon. Wren stood in the yard and looked at the house for a moment, not the way she had looked at it in the early days, with the measuring attention of someone assessing exits and angles. She looked at it the way you look at something that belongs to you, the brief, proprietary look of ownership. And then she turned and walked toward the front door as though the question of where she was going had never been in any doubt. Nora watched her go. She felt Colt come to stand beside her. "She's going to draw," he said. "Yes," Nora said. "She draws when something happens that she needs to hold on to." He was quiet for a moment. "How do you know that?" "Because she did it the morning after the first time she spoke to me on the porch, and the morning after Sybil came, and this morning, before we left. She processes things into images. It's how she keeps them." Colt looked at the door that Wren had gone through. "I didn't know that," he said, not as accusation, as simple information, the statement of a man encountering a fact about someone he loves that had been there to see, and that he had not, until now, seen. "You knew other things," Nora said. "You knew she needed the nightlight left on, even in summer. You knew she couldn't be touched on the shoulder from behind. You knew she liked her bread without salt, and that she'd rather do a thing herself than be helped, even when the thing is harder that way." She looked at him. "You knew years of her. I've known her a few weeks." He turned his head to look at her. The afternoon light was full on his face, and she could see all of him in it. The weathering, the tiredness, and underneath those things, the quality she had been noting in pieces and was now seeing as a whole. The fundamental decency of him, the bone-deep commitment to doing right by the people in his care, not from ambition or performance, but from whatever it was in a person's nature that simply required it. "Nora," he said. She waited. He looked at the road for a moment, then back at her, with the expression of a man who has been composing something and is now committed to delivering it regardless of the difficulty of the words. "When I placed that advertisement," he said, "I was looking for something functional. Someone to help with the household. Someone to satisfy the legal requirement of the hearing." He stopped. I didn't think I was looking for." He stopped again, and the stopping was not uncertainty about what he wanted to say, but about the inadequacy of language for the size of what he was attempting to carry in it. "You are not what I was looking for," he said finally. "You are considerably more than what I was looking for, and I am not certain how to account for that." She looked at him. The light was warm and the yard was quiet, and somewhere inside the house, a child was drawing the shape of something she needed to keep. "You don't have to account for it today," she said. "I know." He looked at her hands, then back at her face. "But I want to say it. While I am standing here in front of you, and you have not walked away." A pause. "You could have walked away any number of times. The night we told you the full situation. When Edmund sent the letter. When Sybil told you the scope of it." He looked at her steadily. "You stayed." "Yes," she said. "Why?" It was the simplest question and the largest one, and she had been turning it over carefully from all angles until she understood its actual dimensions rather than its apparent ones. "Because Wren needed someone who would stay," she said. "At first. That was the first reason, and it was enough." She met his eyes. "And then you sat on the floor outside her door, and I understood that you had been doing that alone for a long time. And that became a reason too." She paused. "And then this place became the place I compare things to. The hills here. The smell of the air in the morning. The way the light comes through the kitchen window in the late afternoon." She looked at the house, then back at him. "I didn't plan any of it. It happened the way things happen when you are not guarding against them because you did not think they were approaching." He was very still, the kind of still that was not restraint but attention, full, unmanaged attention. "I would like you to stay," he said. "Not for the hearing, not for Wren, though she needs you." He looked at her with the directness that always cost him something, and that he offered anyway. "I would like you to stay for the reason that I did not know I needed another person until there was suddenly a specific person, and the idea of that person not being here became something I could not comfortably think about. The wind moved through the yard, lifting the dried grass at the edge of the fence, carrying with it the smell of the fields and the cold that was coming, and the particular smell of this place that she had learned as her own. "I'm already staying," she said. "I told you that before." "I know," he said, "but I wanted to ask anyway, properly." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Ask me properly then." And something moved through his face that she had not seen there before. Not quite a smile, though it lived in the same place a smile would live. The relaxation of features that have held a long time and are finally, tentatively, considering release. "Stay," he said. "Please." "Yes," she said. "All right." It was not a grand declaration. It did not require one. The important things rarely did. They were most themselves when they were simple, when the words were plain and the meaning behind them was the entirety of the weight. He reached out then and took her hand, not dramatically, not with any ceremony, just the direct and unhesitating reaching of someone who has decided to stop treating the distance as necessary and is now simply closing it. His hand was warm and rough, and she felt the particular solidity of it, the way it held without gripping, firmly enough that she knew she was held, and with enough care that she could have left at any moment if she had wanted to. She did not want to. They stood in the yard as the afternoon light moved through its last good hour, hands held without comment, looking at the house and the hills behind it, and the sky that had finally committed to clear. Inside there was the sound of paper, the small, deliberate sound of a pencil moving. Wren drawing. Theo appeared on the porch with an apple and the book of illustrated maps, and settled himself into the chair there with the ease of a boy who has located himself correctly in the world. He opened the book and bit the apple, and did not look at Nora and Colt in the yard, which was its own form of tact. The reconvened hearing came 3 weeks later, on a morning that was genuinely cold, the season no longer reconsidering but arrived. Edmund came with his lawyer and 2 additional men who were introduced as character witnesses, and Nora recognized in this expansion of his contingent the recalibration she had been expecting, the strategic adjustment of a man who has encountered resistance and increased his resources in response. She had expected it. She had prepared for it. She had spent the 3 weeks between hearings working through every document connected to Edmund's previous legal activities that Sybil could access or recall, building a picture of a man whose relationship with the truth was consistently instrumental, not dishonest in the reflexive, careless way of someone who simply preferred convenience, but dishonest in the calculated way of someone who treated verifiable reality as a negotiating position. She had found 3 additional instances of discrepancy between Edmund's stated accounts and documentable fact. None of them were, individually, as significant as the false testimony about his knowledge of Wren's location. Together, they were a pattern. She presented the pattern. She presented it in the same level tone she had used in the first hearing, with the same structure. Foundation first, then the weight-bearing elements, then the visible parts. She presented Sybil's account and its witnesses. She presented the 3 additional discrepancies and their documentation. She presented last a single page that summarized the cumulative picture. A man who consistently shaped his stated reality to serve his immediate purpose, who had treated his daughter's situation as a financial and legal asset rather than a human responsibility, and whose renewed interest in his child was demonstrably correlated with financial developments rather than paternal concern. Edmund's lawyer made his arguments. They were good arguments. She had expected good arguments. She had built her case to remain standing under good arguments, which required anticipating them and addressing them in advance, which she had done. The official asked questions. She answered them. Edmund's lawyer interjected. She responded each time in the same even tone, without heat, with only the clarity of someone presenting information and trusting it to bear its own weight. At one point, the official looked directly at Edmund and asked him to explain, in his own words, the discrepancy between his sworn testimony regarding his knowledge of his daughter's whereabouts and the account provided by the named witness. Edmund looked at the official. He looked briefly at Nora. Something moved through his face in the silence that followed. Not the controlled composure she had come to expect, but something behind the composure, something that had always been behind it and was only now, under the specific pressure of this room and this question with no adequate answer, becoming visible. The calculation of a man encountering a problem that cannot be solved by the usual methods. He said that the account had been misunderstood, that the conversation had been informal, and the record of it imprecise. Sybil, called to speak, confirmed the account with the exact particularity of someone who had prepared for this moment for 2 years and had not rushed it. The official made his notes. The decision took 2 days. Nora spent them in the same disciplined waiting she applied to everything, continuing to work, continuing to be present, continuing to run the ranch alongside Colt and tend to Wren and listen to Theo's monologues about the places in his map book. She did not discuss the hearing in that time. There was nothing more to do about it. On the morning the decision arrived, the frost was heavy, and the sky was the clear, hard blue of winter fully present. The letter came at midday, delivered by a rider who waited at the gate while Colt walked out to receive it, and who then left without ceremony. Colt brought the letter inside. He set it on the table. He looked at Nora. "You open it," he said. She opened it. She read it in the kitchen light with the stove warm behind her, and the sound of Wren drawing at the table and Theo's boots on the floor overhead, and the smell of the bread she had learned to make in this kitchen, in the particular way that this oven required it to be made. Permanent guardianship was awarded to Colt Raines. Edmund's right to petition was not extinguished. A man could not be permanently prevented from access to his child by a single proceeding. But the official's language made clear the weight he assigned to the documented discrepancies, and the standard Edmund would need to meet in any future filing was now considerably higher than it had been before. She set the letter on the table. She looked at Wren, who had looked up from her paper at the sound of the letter being set down. Dark eyes, steady, watching her. Nora said quietly, "You're staying here." Wren looked at the letter, looked at Nora. Then she looked at Colt, who was standing at the door with the expression of a man in the process of receiving something he had been afraid to want. Wren stood up from the table. She walked to Colt and stood in front of him, and then she did something Nora had not seen her do in all the weeks she had been here. She put her arms around him, not hesitantly, not with the tentative quality of a child testing whether an embrace would be accepted. She held on with the directness of someone who has decided and whose decisions, once made, are made completely. Colt's arms came around her. He held her the way he held the injured animals, firmly, with care, with the patience of someone who will stay as long as staying is needed. He did not say anything. His face was turned away from Nora, and she was glad of it because some things were not meant to be witnessed directly, and she occupied herself with the letter in her hands, giving him the privacy of the moment. Theo appeared in the doorway from the hall, looked at the scene, looked at Nora's face, and understood everything in approximately 1 second. "Good," he said simply, and went to find his apple. Sybil came to the door 2 days after the decision arrived, unannounced as always, with the manner of someone who already knows the answer and has simply come to confirm it. Nora told her in the terms she knew Sybil preferred: direct, complete, without embellishment. Sybil listened. Then she set her cup down and said, with the particular economy of a woman who does not waste words on things that do not require them, "Good." She stayed for 1 cup of coffee and left before the second was finished. It was, Nora understood, exactly the right amount. Later, after a dinner that was larger than usual because Nora had decided that the occasion required effort, after Theo had gone to bed with the satisfied immediacy of a boy who has eaten well, after Wren had drawn 2 pages in her notebook and shown Nora both of them, one was the ranch, complete and detailed, with 4 figures in front of it. The second was simply the word home, written in the careful letters she was still practicing, surrounded by a border of lavender drawn from observation. After all of this, Nora stood at the basin washing the dinner things and felt the day settling into its completed shape around her. She heard Colt behind her. She heard him stop. She turned. He was holding the bundle of letters from the barn. He held them without ceremony, without explanation, as though he had gone to get them the way you go, to get any necessary thing, because the moment for it had arrived, and there was no longer a reason to wait. "I'm going to read them," he said. She looked at the bundle in his hands, the worn leather cord, the softened edges of the envelopes. "All right," she said. "Not tonight," he said. "I think not tonight, but soon." "All right," she said again. He set them on the shelf, not behind the box in the barn where they had lived in their long suspension, but here, in the house, on the shelf where the books were, where they could be seen and approached at the pace that was right. He looked at them for a moment. Then he looked at her. "Thank you," he said, for letting me get here at my own speed." She looked at him across the width of the kitchen. The lamp was low and the stove was warm, and outside the wind had come up, moving through the grass with the sound she had learned as belonging here, the particular voice of this land in the cold months. "You did the same for me," she said. He looked at her with the question of that. "You let me figure out what I was doing here at my own pace," she said. "You didn't require me to know before I was ready to know. You just kept leaving room." Something in his expression opened in the way that things opened in him, slowly, entirely, the way a door swings when it has finally been decided to leave it open permanently. He crossed the kitchen to where she was standing, not quickly, not with any of the drama that the moment might have supported, in a different story, with different people, just directly, the way he did everything, having decided, and then moving. He stood in front of her, close enough that she could see the lines at the corners of his eyes, the texture of the years in his face, all the evidence of the life that had made him this specific person and no other. He took her face in his hands the way you hold something you have learned the precise weight of and are no longer afraid of dropping, and he kissed her the way he did everything that mattered, with his full attention on it, without hurry, without performance, with the complete and unhesitating presence of someone who has finally arrived somewhere and knows it. When he pulled back, the kitchen was very quiet. The lamp made its small sound. The stove breathed its warmth. Outside, the wind moved and the land moved with it, and the hills held their shapes against the dark sky as they had held them through every kind of weather and every kind of night, and would continue to hold them long after all of this had become the past. "Stay," he said again. The same word, but different now. Larger. Addressed to something larger. "I told you," she said, with the small smile that had been making its increasingly frequent appearances in the weeks she had been here. "I already am." She would write to Theo's school in the morning, the good one, the one he deserved, where his restless intelligence would be met with something worthy of it. She would sit with Wren and continue the work of the herb drawings, the careful botanical record they were building together page by page, a document of what grew in this place and what each thing was for. She would continue learning the letters of this land, the way the sky read before rain, the habits of the seasons, and the particular requirements of each. She would continue learning the language of the man standing in front of her, which was not a simple language, but was a consistent one, with its own grammar and its own idioms and its own beauty for someone patient enough to learn it. There was a great deal still to do. The future of the ranch, the continued management of Edmund's potential return, the long work of a life built in a specific place with specific people, all of it was still ahead of her, incomplete, requiring effort, requiring the continued application of everything she knew and the learning of everything she did not yet know. She had come here with almost nothing. A bag, a brother, a notebook of her father's knowledge, and the particular kind of determination that looks like practicality from the outside but is something else entirely from within. She had found her way by answering an advertisement. She had kept it by choosing, every day since her arrival, to remain. Outside, the wind moved through the winter grass, and the stars came out above the hills, more of them than she had ever been able to count. The vast, uninterrupted display of the open country sky that she was still not accustomed to, and hoped she never fully would be. Wren's lamp was burning in her room, which it did every night, which it would continue to do. The horses were settled. The frost would come again by morning. Everything was as it should be. Everything was in its place. And the woman who had arrived with almost nothing stood in a warm kitchen in the house that had become her home, in the life she had not planned and would not have traded, and understood that this, the difficult, imperfect, irreplaceable particular of this, was exactly what she had been looking for, even when she had not known she was looking, even when she had believed she was only looking for survival. It turned out that survival, given enough time and the right specific circumstances and the courage to stay when staying was hard, had a way of becoming something better. Something that, in the end, felt very much like joy.